Hi, this is Jeffrey Wernick. Fortunately, this week it looks like we might have a the Fein Print without Bruce Fein. Bruce is engaged in a deposition that's running long. Uh, he said he'll make his best effort to get here, but I wouldn't count on it. And we hope he can join. Um, happy to welcome back Clark, who I had an interview with a couple of months ago, and I thought it was a great interview, and hope to see Clark joining this panel on a somewhat regular basis at his discretion. And Ryan would like me to apologize on his behalf that he's having technical issues, so that he's had problems with his camera working, and it wasn't working last night when he did his own show, and still having technical issues. But if we can't see Ryan, at least we can listen to him, and that's worth it. So happy to have Ryan, even if we can't see you, Ryan. At least we can hear you. So thank you for making it here.
Thank you.
Um, I think that, in talking about, what kind of year 2025 was, I'd like to go back to a theme that we've talked a lot here, is the evolution of a even greater, imperial president, than started the year because of some of the Supreme Court rulings. And I'd like to talk about one issue in particular to start off with as an illustration of that, and who I think we have to blame for it. Okay, we read over the weekend that American soldiers were killed in Syria. Um, so I will start off by saying who I blame for this, and there are many people I blame. So one I blame is our president, who's commander in chief, who made a decision to deploy soldiers, not for us to participate in a war, but basically as a police keeping force. That's not the role of the military. The commander in chief is only should only really, as opposed to how our framework is predicated upon, so that the military should not be deploying any forces until the president says there's a problem, goes to Congress, gets congressional authorization, and after congressional authorization, then he becomes commander in chief of forces that Congress authorized him to use, but he has no right to do anything until he gets authorization from Congress. So the first person I blame is Trump for putting troops in harm's way to perform a function they're not supposed to do. They're not police. They're not a peacekeeping force. They're a force to defend us against threats where the threats are us, and we deploy them only when the president goes to Congress, and says there's a threat. I want you to approve me using these forces to deal with a threat to our national security. If they're not a threat to our national security, they shouldn't be deployed. So first, I blame the president. Second, I blame Congress for not impeaching the president for deploying troops that should have never been deployed with their authorization and should never be deployed for these types of purposes because that's not the role. Okay. Third, I fault the Supreme Court for basically enabling the president to do a lot without congressional authorization. And so I hold guilty the Supreme Court as well for aiding and abetting these circumstances. And finally, I hold the American people responsible for allowing their elected representatives to ignore their main oath of office, which is to uphold, protect, defend the Constitution. Okay? We don't vote for people on their agenda and their ideology. Their first responsibility is that whatever their agenda, whatever their ideology is, whatever action they take, that action is faithfully complying with constitutional guidelines. So we, the people, have let people not comply with the Constitution. We've let Congress not hold the president responsible for allowing the president to usurp what's congressional authority. And I hold guilty the Supreme Court for basically allowing what I believe is an illegal, delegation of powers that were the Constitution vested in Congress, and basically, to the extent that Congress as an institution seems to have failed, that has let this president assume a lot of powers, and I think the Constitution is pretty clear that really are Article 1 powers and not Article 2 powers. Clark, what do you think of my opening statement?
I don't necessarily disagree. I don't think this is where any of the interesting action is right now, so I'm not sure how much I would focus on it. The presidents have deployed military forces throughout the world, throughout all of our history, in many cases without congressional authorization, particularly since the Vietnam War. I don't see that changing anytime soon. I think there are a number of other areas where the exercise of presidential power is of greater concern, and has a more direct and more problematic effect on people. So I don't necessarily disagree with your analysis. I just don't think that focusing on the use of military force in far-flung lands is likely to be fruitful, simply because it's something that's been part of the fabric of our sort of national foreign policy for so long. I suppose if somebody wants to sort of fetishize that issue, they could. I wouldn't, as a constitutional lawyer, because it's not going to change. And I think we could probably better direct our attention to things that have a bigger impact and are more likely to be amenable to pushback and resolution than that one. So I wouldn't pick that one. I don't disagree. I think it's problematic, but I think you could basically spend the rest of your life raising those points and not move the needle even a little bit.
And which ones are the ones that you would raise that you think where we move the needle the most and the quickest?
Well, right now, I think that the administration's use of military force to attack and eliminate unarmed civilians on the high seas for allegedly transporting drugs is categorically different than the use of military forces against bona fide terrorist organizations like ISIS, for example. And that's something that I think merits a great deal of attention because, as I'm sure your listeners know, since September, the Trump administration has used the military to attack and destroy I think a couple of dozen boats with the loss of scores of lives without any real clear legal basis for doing so. And in at least one incident, there appears to have been a follow-on strike, what's sometimes referred to as the double tap, where shipwrecked survivors who were clinging to wreckage from the first strike were deliberately struck with a follow-up missile, possibly pursuant to an order from either the Secretary of Defense or elsewhere to leave no survivors. And if that's the case, I think there's virtual universal agreement that violates both domestic and international law and would have been akin to murder. I think that's a really big deal. And I would hope, although I'm not super encouraged by what I'm seeing so far, that Congress would exercise its oversight powers to get to the bottom of what happened and to determine both whether the administration, in fact, has some legal memo for the Office of Legal Counsel, which they purport to have, that finds a legal basis for those for the use of force in those incidents, and also assess independently whether Congress itself believes that use of military force against these alleged drug couriers to destroy their craft and kill them on the open sea is or is not consistent with U.S. law. Again, I think there's a fairly healthy consensus among experts that it is not, but it is Congress's job to get to the bottom of that.
Yeah, I'll jump in real quickly and add that, I agree with the way you broke that down, Clark. And I definitely, I think the way to say it, like you said, is that the actions taken there in regard to the claim of Venezuelan narco trafficking is much more obvious and easily digestible to the average people. It's a crime. It's very clear. mired conversation of Syria and plenty of other foreign policy, it's much more difficult to get the average people on, it's debatable to people's minds, even though I argue, just as obvious. But I would add, though, that I think what's important about the Syria conversation that does make it larger in most senses is obviously the large sprawling situation around it, but the current reality of the government. And we're talking about Jilani and literal Hayat al-Sham, Al-Qaeda, ISIS offshoots while we're talking about fighting ISIS. I just think that's very important to larger than just the war conversation, like the real foreign policy dynamic of groups like Israel, the UK, United States, and what they've been doing. And I do even think there's an overlap to what's going on with Venezuela, but I'm more interested in what you think about moving forward with where that goes. And if you actually think that there's going to be some level of accountability, impeachment, I mean, do you even see that being possible? Because I agree. I do think that that's where we can get the most motion right now.
Yeah, no, I think impeachment is completely off the table. It shouldn't be, but I'm sure that it is, based on sort of what we've seen from Congress over the past 11, 12 months. I mean, I think again, reasonable people can differ in terms of how you count it up, but I think that there have been a number of incidents or exercises of power by the current Trump administration that rose to the level of impeachment, but not even a peep out of Congress, really. So I think that's unrealistic, but some amount of oversight, some amount of pushback for this, I think, really extraordinary escalation, and not just escalation in terms of quantity, but also the nature of the use of force. This attempt to analogize alleged drug couriers operating small craft in international waters to an actual terrorist organization, or to characterize them as somehow being, an imminent threat to the United States, or engage in combat operations. I just don't find that any of that holds up. And I think it's really important that Congress exercise, at a minimum, its oversight role, and hold hearings and publicize the conclusions that it makes about the legality and the legitimacy of those actions. I mean, it appears that we are killing unarmed people on the high seas simply for transporting substances. It appears not even to the United States. Venezuela does not produce an appreciable amount of opioids. It appears to be that these boats, if they are carrying drugs at all, they're carrying cocaine. It also appears that these boats are headed not to the United States, which they could not reach, nor to any transshipment points that would end up in the United States, but instead probably to the country of Suriname in South America, and where they're expected to transship the drugs to Africa or Europe. Just the connection to any bona fide U.S. security interest, I think, is so tenuous as to be kind of risible. And I wish Congress would step up and exercise its constitutionally mandated oversight role here. But we've heard some noises, we've seen a little bit of interest, but it should be much more. This should be a national scandal.
What do you think this is about? Like, I agree with everything you just said, even the point about the distance, which nobody brings up, and I think that's very clear. Just in your opinion, but what do you think is actually the intention if you don't think that they're fighting drugs? Would I agree with you?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I wouldn't presume to know. I think it's very difficult to get inside Donald Trump's head, in part because I don't think that there's a lot of strategic thought going on there. I think that Trump tends to act on other impulses besides, sort of a deep appreciation of or development of strategy and the pursuit of discernible national interests. I think more often than not, he seems to be sort of acting on impulse and or, in pursuit of sort of personal proclivities. So here, I think it's a combination of Trump wanting to just project a muscular foreign policy and perhaps also send a message to Maduro, the president of Venezuela, that he continues to exercise power over that country and sort of refuses our increasingly unsubtle signals that he should step aside, that perhaps we are prepared to step up our use of military force from simply striking these drug couriers off the coast of Venezuela to perhaps military force within Venezuelan borders. I don't know if that's likely. I don't know if that's something that the administration has in mind. I don't know if that's a signal that Trump is wanting to send consciously or unconsciously. But again, I think very few people ever got rich sort of guessing or betting on what Trump was or wasn't thinking. He's a fairly impulsive chief executive, as best I can tell. And I think we can see from a number of policies, including how, variable our tariff policy has been. It doesn't pursue any sort of discernible strategic through line that I can see.
Ryan, what's your speculation?
In regard to the motivation?
Yes.
There's a lot of moving parts to this. There really are very obvious. We could talk about the resources, even simply gold and oil historically, or the obvious rare earth mineral interest in lithium in Venezuela. That's been a long-term interest, even as much as this, whether this is relevant or not, Elon Musk has even made reference to that, both in Bolivia and Venezuela. There's those aspects of it. I know that there's been a long-sought effort to regime change Venezuela through multiple administrations, kind of the same point, but I think there's also political intentions there, as Clark pointed out. It can't just be simply just wanting to project strength. I actually wouldn't put that off almost more likely than it should be to with something so serious. I think that's kind of what Trump has shown himself to do. Other than that, I do think that there's a larger geopolitical game taking place around some of these locations, and that overlaps with sort of I don't know, I would call it like the reimagining of society we're seeing with network states and charter cities, and what they're doing in El Salvador, in Prosper, and Honduras. And I do think there's an intention around the land in Venezuela, so those, again, like Clark says, it's all just estimation based on what we're seeing, but I think those things are very real agendas. But whether that's why they're doing this, it's hard to say. But I agree.
Let's just think about what we've heard from both
Go ahead.
Clark and you, Ryan. What we've heard is that the president is engaged in all these aggressive activities, which I think all of the panel agrees are illegal and unconstitutional. It all started first with him claiming that that Maduro wanted to overthrow the government here through Tren de Aragua. So first it became that Maduro was sending people over here to disrupt and create chaos in the country, to overthrow the government, that they had taken control over certain housing complexes in certain cities. I think almost all the claims that Trump's made about them have been debunked. But that was the first claim, where Venezuela was a target, and Maduro. Then he basically said Maduro was not actually a president, but he was the head of a cartel that was illegally occupying the government and running a narco state as an illegal actor. So there's been a series of actions to sort of like demonize and this government and delegitimize it. So in preparation for who knows what'll come next, but there's been a series of actions taken that have done both to demonize and delegitimize this administration of Maduro, to justify taking these actions. Now, why did I bring up the Syria part? I kind of put it all linked. We've gotten accustomed to what Clark had referred to, that yes, since the Vietnam era, and if Bruce was here, he would say, Korea, it began in Korea, that basically we've accepted to have the president have extra constitutional powers, when it came to quote, protecting our national interest. And it becomes a broader and broader definition of what our national interest is, to the point there's setting tariffs on every country in the world, including Canada, is a national security issue. That somehow, if we don't get the tariffs right, Canada will invade us or do something, because that's what Canada wants to do. It wants to destroy the security of the United States. So so that's like the broad abuse of these words. So, and I think it's a common constant theme of what we all talk about here is, the degradation of language, and how words are used to a point where, they either lose their meaning, or their current meaning, doesn't even resemble what, the dictionary would say these words mean. So, so I see as a problem that we've become accustomed to basically delegating a lot of these powers to the president. and Congress has emasculated itself because they put partisan politics above their constitutional obligations and responsibilities. I think Clark mentioned, that we should have had. There was an investigation. It was closed pretty quickly. I guess the GOP heard from a couple of people they wanted to hear from. They looked at the video and said, there's no there, and we're not going to talk about it anymore. So the question is how much more will the American people continue to talk about it and put pressure on it so that they're not allowed to get away? Will actually the American people put as much pressure on what Trump is doing, in Venezuela and elsewhere, as they put on the release of the Epstein files? So, we don't know what's important, to the public, but what I'm saying, it should be important to the public. It should be important to Congress. Ultimately, it should be important to us that at the end of the day, we have to hold each branch responsible for doing its duties and functions as defined by the Constitution. And ultimately, if any branch decides to either usurp and go extend beyond its boundaries, or one just decides to allow itself to be usurped, that ultimately that can only happen by us not doing anything about it. So I think that was the point I was trying to make, is ultimately, and I don't disagree with Clark. Do I think me pointing out is going to change anything? No, it won't. Is the example Clark gave something that's a more obvious example that should hopefully incite more people to say, I need to speak up. The many things I can understand why maybe Trump's in Syria trying to do that. There are terrorists there, but this thing of just shooting without any sense of due process, that's not America. We don't do these types of things, and that would call people's attention. And it's kind of curious that, apparently they can show every video that's convenient for them, and they never reveal sources and methods, but any video that's inconvenient for them apparently needs to stay classified because they'll reveal something that we're not entitled to know. So we don't know what would be revealed by showing the double tap, that would not be revealed on showing the first strike. We don't know, and of course that's not explained to us, and we accept that. And the same with that, we accept what Clark referred to also, is that they have a memo. They have a memo saying that that's legal, yet nobody can allow to see the logic associated with that memo. Now, I don't think that memo used sources and methods that came from spies, because the memo should be based upon, legal precedent, jurisprudence, and construction of the Constitution. So what would be the basis for classifying a memo about why this is, a legal thing to do? So, and why would, again, this is, the president does this. It's clearly illegal. The Congress basically waives their obligation to, impeach a president when they go beyond their Article 2 powers, because that's their job. Their job is, when the president goes beyond the Article 2 powers, they gotta either discipline him in various ways, or if he ignores those ways or she ignores those ways, they got to impeach them. And ultimately, if Congress refuses to impeach a president that doesn't honor, respect, and uphold the Constitution, which is his oath, it's the only oath he takes, then we can vote people out of office who don't want to run a constitutionally based government. Clark?
Yeah, all of that is true, but I still think that there are more and less fruitful subjects to focus our attention on at any given time. And I wouldn't presume to tell somebody, hey, don't talk about this issue, because I personally don't think that it's got a high enough, return on investment of effort. But I do think that if one wants to be effective in public policy, it at least some thought should be given to, I think, choosing which issues seem most amenable to constructive improvement by commenting on them, if that makes sense. And reasonable people can differ about what those are. But I do think that when the public is particularly concerned and upset about something, like I think the public is very focused on these military strikes on boats in the Caribbean and off the Pacific coast of South America, that's an important issue and one that's garnering significant public attention. So that's where I would tend to put more attention right now.
And what more attention? I mean, it seems like the Republicans have tried to now say this has been discussed. It's a settled issue. What do you think we could do now to continue to indicate to the Republicans that that's just not acceptable to us, that it's not a settled issue?
Yeah, that's my perception as well. Honestly, I think it depends on what somebody's personal, proclivities and aptitudes are. I mean, if you can write a letter to the editor of your local paper, do that. If you can write a good blog post and send that to your representative, do that. If you have a direct contact to the office of a conscientious senator or a House member, particularly if they're a Republican, reach out and tell them that you strongly object. If in fact you do, I hope you do strongly object to the military engaging in extrajudicial killings of non-combatants and people who are not plausibly characterized as terrorists in our names. That's the most important thing to remember. This is being done in our names. The United States military is killing unarmed civilians on the high seas who cannot plausibly be character to express to their elected representatives.
Ryan, what do you think?
On which point?
On the points Clark just made about what we can do to make sure, if our representatives want to decide that this is a settled issue, what can we do? What should we be doing to remind them that it's just unacceptable that this be considered a settled issue? What we're doing, and what we continue to do on an ongoing basis.
Yeah, maybe we should go ahead.
No, that's it.
Okay. Maybe it was only on my end, but Clark, you were cutting out pretty badly toward the end, so I missed part of your argument. But I think that what we talk about often on this show is that, obviously I agree with what I heard from you saying that, do what you can where you can, right? Whether that's just speaking out, whether that's speaking to the paper, talking to your politicians, protest, all these things have some level of effect. But a lot of this has been kind of undermined. And right now today, we're not being listened to, and I'm of the mind, going even further than what we generally talk about on the show, that a lot more has happened in regard to the power structure slowly removing what influence we have on its outcome. And so, to the point to where I argue our votes don't even truly translate to the outcome at this point, but I'm sure people disagree with that. But where we're at now, it seems like what we need, because what we talk about would be impeachment, right? That'd be the obvious reality of the way the system should work, is that you're breaking the law in a fundamentally obvious way. That's whether we're, even taking obvious issues in the United States, like blatantly unconstitutional without question, and then we just debate about it. Things are happening like that, the same kind of thing in regard to killing these people in the boats. It's obviously a criminal act. So impeachment's not going to happen, even though I've seen, I think, Green float the idea more than once. It's not going anywhere. So at this point, in my mind, I think what we need is just mass action from average people. Not to say that that's even going to, guarantee the outcome, because when you're dealing with a, dystopian dictatorship kind of idea, whether that's what you think this is or not, just an authoritarian government, then I don't think that they're really going to respond outside of being forced. But what we need is to show the world first that we don't agree with this. But the why that's so difficult is because of the team sport partisan game that everyone focuses on, as if that represents the entire conversation. I don't believe it does anymore. I believe most Americans are absolutely in line with what Clark is saying, like 100%. It's very obvious. We see it, but then we're focusing on this fake mainstream alternative kind of divide conversation that doesn't really meet that. But so my point is, speak out, stand up, like Clark said, go out there and do something about it. But to the point of like civil disobedience. I think we need to start making this difficult, but not in a way where you're breaking the law. I'm not speaking for violence, but I think that is where we need to start. But, protesting, papers, writing stuff, doing interviews, is what I think.
It seems to me that also the media has been sort of like irresponsible on this issue. Even the media that's not necessarily, pro-Trump has I don't know if they're worried about getting litigated or what, but it seems to me that one is there a couple of things is that people right now tend to only follow platforms where they get their beliefs validated and echoed. So so the if you're pro-Trump, you're likely watching media that, on the most part, will justify these actions because they'll focus on the threat that they believe and they view that as more important than following the Constitution. They'll just make sure. I mean, not unlike the treatment of Abrego Garcia. No, he still gets referred to as they still make allegations about him. Now that I guess the release order has been made, I don't know if he's actually been released. I remember there was a release order made, but
Yeah,
they
he's
still
out.
make allegations reporting to him as someone who's a gangbanger and a wife beater, and so they're still trying to dehumanize him, and demonize him, and every time they write about him, so that you're appalled by the fact that he's let free, and he's let free by judges, that hate the country. So I mean that's the narrative we have right now. Is the fact is that if you don't agree with this stuff, it's because this judge must have been appointed by Obama or Biden, or somebody who hated the country, and they're not respecting the commander in chief.
I
So
agree with all that, Jeffrey.
and
I
that
just
they
don't think it's the
voted
majority.
and the public overwhelmingly voted for the commander in chief to do what he's doing, and people are just getting in the way.
I just don't think it's
So
the majority of people. I mean, and that's kind of the issue with. I mean, it's an important point because we all agree on this. I would think that that's clearly happening, but I think part of that whole, I guess, manipulation is to get us to overfocus on that and feel like that's almost insurmountable. It's like learned helplessness in a way. I believe most Americans, in a lot of ways, to a varying degree on different topics, are seeing a lot of this. My mind it tends to be the same, is that right now, I mean, first and foremost, they wouldn't constantly lie and project if they didn't think they needed to, right? I think Americans today are slowly awakening to what's going on. And I think that with like taking an issue like this, it's very easy to see that most people understand the basic realities of certain things we're talking about because they constantly point to them and they lie about it, the government. But we're at a point now where it seems like it's completely disconnected from the American people in a lot of ways. And that speaks to a larger kind of globalist foreign policy type of agenda. But to the point, it's just obvious that I think most people are seeing this if you look at the larger conversation. But it is important to point that out, Jeffrey, because that is what people project as the majority of the conversation for a very clear reason, at least as I see it.
yeah, and I do agree. Well, I agree with both you, Ryan, you and Clark. I do think Clark did talk about the fact is that people should write letters to the editors. People should write their representatives, and let them know that they want this issue addressed, and they want a more thorough investigation and more public disclosures on this. I mean, I think people should demand that the videos be be released. I was kind of surprised, Clark. I did I asked. I've done two polls recently on the BitChute account on X. One poll was, should the videos be released to the public? Actually, 23% of the people said no. They don't want it released. I don't know what objection people would have to releasing the video unless they don't want to show what they know it'll show, and that might make people, not support what Trump did. So better keep people ignorant than having the knowledge that you don't want you want to withhold from them. I'm just speculating on that, obviously, but it's hard to explain why 23% of the people would say no. The other thing I did a poll on was Thomas Massey's bill, Promo's bill for the U.S. to withdraw from NATO, uh, which actually got 75% of the people were in support of the withdrawal of NATO, and 25% for staying in NATO. And actually, that poll got a lot more engagement than any poll BitChute had ever done. So and from what I read after checking with Grok about percentage of views that people actually vote on. That poll got a little more than 10% of the people who viewed the poll voted on it, and according to Grok and their study of these statistics, that was excellent engagement for a poll, much better than the average performance of how much people, when they see a poll, how many of them actually engage with the poll. And this one, according to Grok, was excellent engagement, way above average, and was a successful poll. So so I think, given the fact we're all on a public live stream that we hope people are watching, we all want to do our best efforts to influence people to be actively engaged. If not, we would not be here. Clark, you would not be participating, and nor you, Ryan, and I wouldn't be hosting it, is because we do want to have an impact on, the public to be engaged, because the more the public, the best way to hold politicians is accountable. Ultimately, in a constitutional republic, that responsibility falls on the people. I mean, it's our job to make sure people act within the constitutional limits of their responsibilities, and if they don't, we can hold people responsible. At least we can hold people responsible, through the ballot box and through the noise that we make, so that people get alerted to the fact that the ballot box might not treat them well, if they continue to behave this way. And obviously we have the most influence we should be on members of the House, who run every 2 years, and we should let them know, what we expect of them. And I think, Clark identified that really the priority on this in this circumstance should be to write to Republicans, because the Democrats are already going to vote for more disclosures, and 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 um, and so those votes you can count on. It's the Republicans that need convincing. Was that your point, Clark?
Yeah, I
In
think
this
that's right.
case, yes. So sometimes Clark, I thought we've lost Ryan. I don't know. He seems to be having really bad technical issues. And I hope he comes
Yeah.
back. Um, on this point, I sometimes the site. I mean, right now this podcast is the Fine Print, and the Fine Print is associated with BitChute, but also it's its own independent entity. And but when we try and be nonpartisan, except our partisanship comes towards the Constitution, and obedience and faithfulness to the Constitution as we interpret it. And people can certainly question, our approach to interpreting the Constitution. But I think it's hard to interpret what Trump is doing as being legal. And it should be clear that the double tap is, Ryan's back, is should be even more apparent, but it should be pretty apparent that we probably do not have the intelligence linking these people to any activities that would be a direct threat to the national security, of the United States. I would think that of all the drugs that come into this country, if we're concerned about what drugs are killing people, then we should be concerned about the sale and distribution of drugs by those who control the distribution networks here in the United States, which are a greater and more direct threat, to who knows how large a shipment of drugs, and who knows what the ultimate destination of those drugs, really are, and they're probably not the United States. I've kind of insisted that if we really knew they were coming right here and we knew what their path would be, I would think that we would want to follow that path, have them come to the United States, see who picks it up, so we can then get the whole distribution channel and not just the drugs themselves, that we can go up the chain. But we can't get up the chain until it comes here. And if we have that capacity of intelligence of tracking this boat to the higher path, and if it's really come to the United States, it seems to me we can track it all the way here and who it gets delivered to, and then we know who the intended distribution agent was for this cargo that Trump has alleged was going to kill 25 to 50,000 people each cargo shipment. So we could have then arrested everybody and tried them for attempted murder of 50,000 people and see how that worked in a court of law. It probably wouldn't have worked very well in a court of law because we probably don't have the sufficient evidence to bring it to a court of law, which is probably why it's done this way, is because I thought if they ever had to go to a third party and say, here's our evidence for why we're doing it, they find that they probably don't have the justification, for doing so. And that's why I think they're doing it, this way. So, so I thought about, I would like, but, again, this is the problem of doing it through BitChute. I kind of would like if we could put together like templates, for everybody to have a list of every senator and congressman's email, and a template and suggested templates. And if people then want to click a button, we could help them personalize something that they could send out to people, So I'm constantly thinking of ways that we can help people, make it lower the transaction cost about being an active citizen rather than a passive citizen. What do you think, Clark?
No real thoughts.
Yeah, I think.
But if you want to talk about something else, I'm happy to get back in the conversation with you if you want to have a conversation.
Sure, go ahead.
No, you're the host. Take us where you want us to go.
No, where would you like to go?
Well, I think that the current administration is exercising powers in a way that is concerning in ways that look, there hasn't been a presidential administration, and at least in I think our lifetimes, that didn't violate the Constitution in various ways. But I think that to engage in this kind of whataboutism, where you say, well, what about what Obama did, when he did the drone strikes on Al-Akawi, and what about Joe Biden and his flouting the Constitution by trying to forgive student loans. Okay, stipulated there was bad behavior. There's always been bad behavior, or at least going back as far as living memory will go. But that doesn't mean that you don't have an obligation to try to assess the nature and the quality of legal transgressions by a given administration. I think the current one is categorically and qualitatively worse than what we've seen before. And I'm deeply concerned on a number of areas. One that I guess I'll mention right now is just the sheer number of novel and sometimes very difficult questions about the exercise of government power and the constitutionality of that power that are being presented to the courts by the often extremely aggressive and norm busting policies of this administration have created a situation where I think the courts are perhaps at overcapacity, and certainly the U.S. Supreme Court, so that they're having to render decisions more quickly than is optimal, with less deliberation. And that's problematic because at the end of the day, the only thing a court has is the ability to explain the basis for a decision. They don't have the power of the sword. They don't have the power of the purse. They don't really have any independent power at all to enforce their decisions. Court decisions throughout the history of this country have been obeyed by the other branches as a matter of comity, that is to say, cooperation and respect for the power of the judiciary, but not through any independent ability of the judiciary to actually enforce its orders. And so I think that boils down to the court's ability to articulate a persuasive rationale for the decisions they make. And I would say that you can agree, or I'm sorry, you can disagree with the court decision, but still find the rationale persuasive, in the sense that it may not be fully persuasive to you, but you recognize that there's sound reasoning. And again, you may disagree with it, but you concede that is a thoughtful decision about which reasonable people could differ. That's not always the case, and the less time a court has to deliberate, the less able it is, I think, to produce that kind of persuasive analysis that is vital to the legitimacy, I think, to the continued legitimacy of court decisions. And that matters a lot, because that's, of course, our sort of ultimate fallback and safety net, is the ability and the duty of the judiciary to say no to the other branches when they exercise power in a way that's inconsistent with the Constitution. And I do think we've seen a substantial uptick in the amount of policies, the number of policies that are not plausibly authorized by the Constitution on the part of the current administration. I think it's a huge, huge issue.
I have a bunch of thoughts on that. First, I just want to ask
What do you think, Clark, and I'll ask this for you, Ryan, also.
Go ahead.
What do you think in this point? What do you think? I think some of the Supreme Court justices recently said that they don't really have much use for precedent. Um, it seems to me like there's a trade-off associated with precedent. I mean, if a decision was really poorly made, of course you want it reversed if you think it was really poorly decided. But then if you don't have some respect for precedent, then basically every decision could be very temporary and people don't know what to expect. And then you have a system that could be very, very, unpredictable. So, I mean, so what does it do for and I don't know if the justices even care since they have lifetime appointments. So, I don't know how many really are concerned about their legacy, or if they are concerned about legacy, on who judges their legacy. So they might not mind making enemies if they hate their enemies, and they like their friends, and they are not looking them from an academically pure adjudication of the Constitution, so that the powers they could give, the powers that some could give to Trump, they could take away from Trump's successor, because they're not bound by precedent, and those that didn't want to give Trump power might decide, if they like who Trump's successor is, that they would grant those powers, so that ultimately, if you have no sense of respect for precedent, then ultimately every time you have a change of administration, you could be wording your decisions in a way that gives you, a discretion to apply them specifically and uniquely to this president that you don't extend to subsequent presidents, and then you've completely converted the court into a political branch, not a constitutional branch. So I mean, I would think that a lot of the powers, and again, this is pure speculation, a lot of the judgments that have been made by the Supreme Court, might have been judged differently if Biden was the president. Why don't you answer while I step off screen for a second, please? I'm at the hotel room. I got to answer the door. So, but I'm listening.
Well, I think the division of power among the various branches is obviously one of the key features of the U.S. Constitution. The founders, I think, had the really genius insight that if you're going to empower a government, especially a newly constituted government, which of course was the case when the Constitution went into effect in 1789, there was no United States of America and there was no U.S. government prior to the ratification of the Constitution. So you're going to create this potentially very powerful national government. And the founders, as we all know, had the genius insight of dividing that power both horizontally and vertically. And there's been a lot of discussion about whether the institution of judicial review, which is simply the ability of the courts to say no to the other branches, to say you may not enforce that policy because it is not consistent with the Constitution, whether judicial review was or was not part of the basically original understanding of the powers of the judiciary. I don't think that's a serious argument. Judicial review was a fixture within state courts for decades before the ratification of the Constitution. The Article 3, which creates the judicial branch in the Constitution, specifically states that courts have not only the power, but the duty to resolve cases and controversies, and certainly a bona fide dispute about whether the government does or does not possess a particular power is both a case and a controversy. And it's entirely clear to me from the text of the Constitution that there is only one branch that is empowered to resolve that controversy and to have the final say. So I think, again, the courts play an extremely important role in our sort of the ecology of national power. And the ability of a court to offer a persuasive, reasoned explanation for its decision is of paramount importance, and one that has become more challenging given the pace and volume of constitutional litigation engendered by the current administration's policies.
And it seems to me that during the shadow docket period, the court really sided with the president a lot without giving much of an explanation on why they thought that that was defined by the Constitution. So they didn't really put much of an effort to having the public feel that there was a legitimate explanation for it. I guess people could just believe, according to it, did the decision produce the outcome that people wanted it to produce? And so I think many people, if you liked Trump, you liked the outcome. If you didn't like Trump, you disliked the outcome. But given the fact that there was limited explanation, if the same circumstances came up and it was the other side and it would come out, then people would say, I like the outcome and I don't have to argue over the rationale because the rationale was never provided. That doesn't seem, so it seems to me, I mean, I'm asking you just a very speculative question. I mean, it would seem to me that this court, that those that had voted on the shadow docket to really have, what I would interpret as a very expansive definition of the role of the president that's not embedded in the Constitution, that they didn't provide an explanation for two reasons. They probably didn't have a good one, and second, they might not even care about their own reputation as opposed to, giving Trump the power they want him to have, and that they want him to have the flexibility of implementing. Because as I keep going back to in a number of shows the comment that Alito had. I think it was Alito who made the comment where he was caught by somebody who was an undercover investigative journalist who caught him saying we're in like a culture war, and a culture war that has to be won. So if people believe that this is a culture war, it is a war for the soul of the country, and that these methods are, and I've spoken to a lot of people I know who used to be part of the Reagan administration. I said, you liked Ronald Reagan. What makes you find Trump so acceptable? Because in many ways he's a repudiation of Reagan. So given the fact that he's a repudiation of Reagan, what makes you now? And many of them tell me, well, we're in different times now. We're really in a war for a culture war, and it's a war we have to win, and he's our best warrior. So we got to give him the tools to succeed because, the whole nation is at stake. So given the fact that they think the rules of engagement have changed because they view it as being in a wartime and as opposed to in peacetime, and that's how they view the circumstances. So I don't know if the Supreme Court views it, they're intelligent people. I mean, I think they would understand for posterity the fact that they've made all these judgments without providing, adequate textual analysis and legitimization for what they've done. They got to know other people will take a look at this stuff, or how much of it do they not care, and how much of that they don't want to do. Then that by not doing it gives them added flexibility for the future that you haven't found. You don't know how they got to the conclusion. So therefore, if they get to a different conclusion later, there's nothing in text that says they really used a different methodology. So I think there's a lot in what I said, but so I'd like your comments on that, Clark.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would, at a kind of a high level, what I would say is that it's important to think about and observe the behavior of the courts in context. And unfortunately, as you probably know, and many of your listeners know, the U.S. Supreme Court basically threw in the towel on making any meaningful effort to confine Congress to its constitutionally authorized powers back in the wake of the New Deal, and specifically around between 1937 and the early 1940s. If you look at the text of the Constitution, one of the things you'll notice right away is that the U.S. government that was both created and constituted by the ratification of the Constitution is not one of general and plenary power. It doesn't possess what we call a police power, which is not just a power to enforce criminal laws, but really a power to, in effect, try to advance sound public policy across all legitimate facets of government. That would include everything from healthcare to education to potentially providing for people's well-being when they're in poverty or old age, et cetera. That is not a power that the federal government possesses. It only possesses those powers that are delegated to it by the text of the Constitution. And those powers are spelled out with great specificity in Article 1, Section 8. They include things like the ability to run a system of post offices and post roads, to create a system of weights and measures, to have a national bankruptcy law. The idea that the people who wrote the Constitution spelled out all of those powers in such concrete and minute detail, but then also threw in, this sort of general welfare clause and the necessary and proper clause and the commerce clause with the idea that, oh yeah, and then, of course, any other power that Congress thinks it might need to exercise in order to make the U.S. a better place, of course, that comes in too, like having a U.S. Department of Education that is nowhere authorized or mentioned, even in passing, among the constitutionally enumerated powers of Congress. So the point is that if it is the case, and I think, Jeffrey, make a fair point that it is, that the Supreme Court is being excessively deferential to the exercise of presidential power, what I would say is that as problematic and even indefensible as I would say that is, it is entirely in keeping with the Supreme Court's utter indifference to its duty to enforce constitutional limits on the exercise of legislative power, of power by Congress. And the Supreme Court has been standing by with barely even a raised eyebrow as Congress exercises powers that are not remotely delegated to it by the Constitution for coming up on 100 years now. And I don't mean that in a fatalistic way. I don't mean that as, well, we just have to live with the fact that the Supreme Court, for whatever reason, doesn't feel like it's up to the task of enforcing constitutional limits on government power. So if they're going to give Congress a free pass, I suppose they should give the president a free pass. That's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying instead is that, unfortunately, the judiciary, and particularly the Supreme Court, has embraced a philosophy of judging that is, in my judgment, excessively deferential. And what you see is judges bend over backwards to endorse even quite exotic and unpersuasive rationales for the exercise of extra constitutional power, both by Congress and by the president. If I could change one thing about our system, I think that would be high on my list, would be to essentially reconstitute the judiciary.
You're freezing a little, Clark, now, so I'm not hearing what you're saying. No, Clark, I don't know if you're continuing to talk or because you remain frozen on my end, and I don't know if it's my problem or your problem from the internet or both of our Wi-Fi problems. So I don't know if there's anyone who is watching now who might want to comment if they're hearing either me or Clark, and maybe I can read your comments to know where the problem lies, so I know whether I should make a change here or oh, Clark now disappeared. So I think maybe he either we'll see if Clark is coming back or not coming back because of maybe not seeing me respond because of a problem on his end. So well, let's just oh, Clark's coming back on. So let me hit him. Yeah, Clark, I think you were frozen for a little bit. So do you
I
hear
saw
me?
it. I can hear you, and I saw I went off camera for a bit. I'm going to have to wrap this up pretty soon because I've got another commitment. But I'd be happy to sort of engage.
Yeah, I want the last point from what I heard is a very interesting point, and so I want to apply it to a specific example that I think is not being adequately addressed in some of these rulings. The Trump v. Slaughter case. That's that's the case that people expect will will repeal the Humphreys executor case. So this seems to me something that the court seems to be giving inadequate discretion on. You have Congress creating an administrative agency. They vest the administrative agency with powers, uh, and they delegate some of these powers subject to the constraints of how they write the statute, how they write the law, to supposedly an independent body of people to administrate the laws that they kind of establish a framework for through legislative statutes. Okay, so this is how it's created. Okay, so it seems to me the issue is, do they have the right to even create an independent body or not?
Right.
Now it's now what the Supreme Court's ruling is saying is you can create that body, but that body is under complete control over the executive. So, which clearly was not the intent of Congress. So I don't go, for me, the conclusion the Supreme Court should be coming up with is you can't, because I read people saying you can't delegate it to a bureaucrat. But that doesn't mean you delegate, then you're delegating congressional authority to the executive. So, why is it better to delegate it to the executive than some independent body that's accountable to Congress, as opposed to just saying we're creating this and now we're throwing it all over to the executive branch. So now the executive branch even has more power over essentially the legislative process, and the Supreme Court, and this to me is a nuance of the case that the Supreme Court is completely ignoring.
Yeah, well, there's a lot to unpack there. I'll see if I can do it justice in just a minute or two. What I would say is that the challenge here is that when you have a federal government that is as enormous and sprawling as ours is, spending up to $5 or $6 trillion per year and involving itself in nearly every aspect of human life, the ability to implement various federal policies requires the participation of a growing number of bureaucrats and agencies. The question becomes, to what extent does Congress have the constitutional authority to first delegate to these administrative agencies substantial policymaking discretion? Policy is supposed to be the business of the legislative branch, and it's just not something that executive branch actors are supposed to engage in, or at least not more than a de minimis amount. That's the whole point of being the executive branch, the branch that executes policy. And the policy is supposed to be chosen by the legislative branch because they are more democratically accountable to the people in that they have to stand for re-election and are represent particular constituencies as opposed to a president who's elected by the entire country at once. Second question is, to what extent can Congress tie the hands of the president in determining who leads these agencies? So, for example, the Federal Trade Commission consists of 5 commissioners, only 3 of which can be the members of the same political party. And at least as the law is written, the president does not have the authority to remove a member of the Federal Trade Commission, does not have the power to remove a commissioner unilaterally, but has to wait for their term to expire or get Congress to agree. This, of course, to some extent ties the hands of the president. So we've got a situation where the president is, at least in principle, accountable for the decisions and the behavior of this executive branch agency, the Federal Trade Commission, but not fully in control of the leadership of that administrative agency. And of course, for anybody who's ever been a manager or led any sort of an organization, the problem there is apparent, right? It's as plain as day that you've got a chief executive, you've got a president who is accountable for the actions of executive branch agencies, but has been prevented by Congress from controlling who's in charge and who makes the decisions that those agencies act on. As you say, that's the subject of a pending Supreme Court case called Slaughter, involving the administration's attempt to remove a sitting federal trade commissioner. My sense, having listened to the argument, is that probably the Supreme Court is going to find that the president does have the authority to determine who leads executive branch agencies, even when Congress has attempted through legislation to tie the president's hands and say that at least as to certain agencies, the leadership is determined in part by the legislature and is not the leaders of that agency are not subject to unilateral removal by the president. I think that's probably going to go by the wayside. Whether or not the Humphrey's executor case, which was the sort of origin of this idea that the Congress can tie the president's hands as to which who leads executive branch agencies, it may be possible to rule in the administration's favor on the Federal Trade Commission case, the Slaughter case, without overturning Humphrey's executor. So it's unclear whether that case will be overturned, but I think it'll be substantially hollowed out and undermined at a minimum and quite possibly explicitly overturned, so that the result is that the president does have the ability to determine who leads executive branch agencies and can remove people even when Congress purports to say that he can't.
Yeah, my issue that again was the point I tried to raise is the fact is that it seems to me the issue's creation is linked to its issue's governance structure, and the Congress might never have issued the agency if it left the power directly to the president. And so I don't know how the Supreme Court could not. You're separating an issue of separating out governance from the creation when they're really they're interdependent, they're not independent, and to treat it as independent is a fiction. So the honest thing is to me is to cancel the legislation that wrote that restriction in it, not basically said, well, the legislation goes, we know the intent was the legislation wanted to do this based upon this governance structure, and by saying we're not accepting that governance structure, we should eliminate the entire agency, not just basically give the president an absolute control over an agency that was that might never have been created if Congress was told everything that you create, every agency that you create, is that. So if right now, if I take a look at it, if I'm a representative, and I'm creating an agency, I got 90 years of history that this is acceptable. I have a Supreme Court, jurisprudence on this, where there is a precedent case that was determined, on a unanimous basis that this was that this distinction, is legal. So every time I create this, I'm creating it with an understanding that it should not even be a moot point on whether it's legal or not. So the question if you give it that background, if I was a party to an agreement where there was all this fact pattern, okay, it would seem to be absurd that now somebody could say is, well, you know what, all the things you should have relied upon, you should have never relied upon. So, and we're giving all this power, to this other party. How could anyone think that's a just outcome?
Yeah, I agree. I think that's all very well said. I think that to suppose that Congress would have created, all of these different executive branch agencies if it had known that the agency would be under the exclusive control of the president and not subject to the amount of oversight that Congress is perhaps without constitutional authority attempted to impose is a very good point. And just it underscores how difficult it is to sort of put the toothpaste back in the tube when the government has been allowed for years, sometimes decades, or even longer, to exercise powers that are not plausibly conferred and delegated by the Constitution.
Yeah. Also, in labor markets, okay, let's say I'm the person who's been impacted by this. I'm the one who is being fired without cause, even though I feel there's a contract that says I am being fired now without cause, and I accepted the position with the understanding that I can only be fired with cause. A board of directors could require a CEO of a company to basically sign contracts where they limit the CEO's power to not being able to fire people without cause. So if we have a precedent in the business sector, in the business sector, we do have CEOs whose hands are tied. So the question is, I'm the person who's at the FTC or some other agency. I have this jurisprudence. I have these precedents. I took the job under these conditions. Okay, so I accepted the jobs and conditions. How am I not damaged by a decision where it's been clearly clear that any reasonable person would assume that I could not be fired for these reasons? I couldn't anticipate that the Supreme Court judges would just say, well, we want the president to have these powers that throughout our entire history a president has never had, and too bad for you. You should have expected that. So, I think that this was a contract world, where CEO said, well, the board told me, I had to do this, but I'm the CEO. So, I can ignore them and do whatever I want. And whoever's damaged, you have no claim because I have that. It seems to me that's pretty analogous. Why is that analogy not somewhat obvious?
Well, it may or may not be obvious, but good luck trying to get the courts to sort of fully exercise their power and live up to their duty to push back against unconstitutional or otherwise unlawful exercise of government power. As I said a moment ago, that's unfortunately something that's been part and parcel of the judiciary's mindset. Has been what I view as an excessively deferential approach to the other branches exercising powers that are not plausibly conferred by the Constitution. Again, that's not to express despair or resignation, but rather to say it's important to appreciate the magnitude of the problem. Anytime you see the judiciary failing to push back against excessive exercise of government power, including in ways that you've just described, the reaction should not be surprise. It may be dismay and it may be outrage, but it shouldn't be surprise. And Jeff, I'm afraid I got to wrap up
I
now.
agree.
Thanks for
I don't
having me
know
on.
if you're frozen again. Okay, you're good. I know you said you had to go in a few minutes, so I'd like you to have the opportunity of closing on the things that you'd like to talk about that I didn't give you a chance to speak about. So go ahead, and this is your time now.
No, I appreciate it. I don't really have a lot to add other than to say that I appreciate you having me on, and I think it's this kind of dialogue is so important. This conversation is so important because it helps us to remind other people and each other that the hallmark, I would say, and the genius of our constitutional design is not simply the division and allocation of powers across different branches and vertically between the federal government and the states, but also the very clear decision to delegate to the federal government only a very finite set, a very limited set of powers. And really, I think it's quite clear from the history that the Constitution would not have been ratified if the federal government had been understood to possess, what amounts to a general police power of the kind that it clearly exercises today, because everybody at the time, including particularly the anti-federalists who opposed the ratification of the Constitution, recognized the extraordinary risk and danger of a federal government that exercises, essentially plenary powers, just sort of going around looking and thinking what policy could be improved by government involvement. The answer is not many. And that's why the powers of the federal government were so severely constrained by the text of the Constitution. And I think, unfortunately, it's one of the greatest shortcomings, one of the greatest betrayals of the Constitution by the U.S. Supreme Court to effectively read those delegated powers limits out of the document and stand by and acquiesce as both branches, both the Congress and the executive branch, routinely exercise powers that not plausibly delegated to the Constitution and in violation of key constitutional structures, including separation of powers and the Appointments Clause.
No, thank you so much, and I think I agree with everything you just said, Clark, and I hope that people watch your concluding comments over and over again as a reminder of how they should look at the Constitution. So I think I will ask that we have a specific clip of your closing comments so that we can really put them on all the platforms that we share our content with. So we'll give as many people the opportunity of hearing your words on your terms. So thank you so much for your participation here, Clark. I'd like to wish you Merry Christmas and Happy New Year and Happy Holidays, whatever holidays you choose to celebrate, and just a wonderful season's greetings. And really, I appreciate so much your participation.
Well, thanks so much. It's been a pleasure. I've enjoyed our conversation. I hope people find it worthwhile. And I'm flattered that you would, select that last clip to share with people. There's nothing more important than constitutionally limited government. So I'm glad that people are going to focus on it. I'll see you later.
Thank you so much. Bye, Clark.